Hello everybody, welcome to our e-bike light shootout. This year we have 11 bikes battling it out. Come along for a ride as we see how they perform out on the trails. We would like to thank the Running Y Resort here in Klamath Falls, Oregon for hosting us. It is a great spot to come and stay. There are two really awesome trail networks within a 5 to 10 minute drive in either direction. Make sure you stay at the Running Y if you come down to Klamath Falls. Of course, we would like to thank Outdoor Research for kitting us out, Schwalbe Tires for giving us a constant test tire across all the bikes, and Ride Concepts shoes. And of course, some of our YouTube members out there helping. All of those brands and supporters are why we are able to come out here with a big crew and put these group tests together. So thank you very much. And of course, all of you viewers and commenters, we appreciate you. So we've got 11 bikes and we are gonna work our way through them. We have detailed reviews of each of these bikes leading up to this grand finale. So if you want more in-depth and detailed reviews, you can either head to the loamwolf.com or check out our video library of all the other reviews where we go much more in depth. So let's dive into the 11 bikes and see where they stand out and how much we like. About to take off on the DJI Amflow in 10 seconds here. I'm gonna prep the turbo boost. Set, go, 29. Good Lord. First up, let's talk about, I think, probably the most interesting bike, or at least the bike everyone wants to know about, and that is the Amflow PL Pro Carbon.
Certainly the bike people know the least about that has a lot of hype right now.
Yeah.
In terms of, when I say know the least about, maybe least, like people just haven't ridden this bike.
Right. I'd have to say, like, it's pretty legit.
Yeah.
Motor-wise,
yeah.
Like, it's quite impressive, especially in our field of test bikes. You know, we only have, I guess, 2 other full power motors that's not even comparable on trail feel.
Mm-hmm. So let's go through travel and some key geo numbers here.
So the Amflow comes in at a 150 mil rear with a 160 mil fork, 475 mil reach, 64.5 degree head tube angle, all very familiar numbers. We do also see it having a 77 degree seat tube angle. Again, very familiar. There was nothing out of the ordinary as far as geo goes, I feel, on this bike.
Okay. Let's get into some of the drive unit stats. Battery, electronics, app, Mr. Electronic Man.
So our bike came with the 800 watt hour battery, the biggest on test and probably one of the biggest we've used in recent years. Outside of Canyons, they've got a 900 watt hour battery, but different story. There's an Avinox 2-inch OLED touchscreen. Amflow has 2 different buttons on each side of the cockpit. One controls your power modes and the other controls your screen display. The app is one of the best I've used. It's easy to pair with the bike. You can set up everything. It'll track your rides. There's an anti-theft portion of it if you have that enabled. And then if you've got a SIM card, you can also have it hooked up to 4G. So you can kind of keep track of it everywhere.
Charge port was another thing that I thought was really cool about that bike.
Yeah, it's super sleek, tucks into the frame nicely. And it's held in spring retained, so keeps all the dirt out.
And very, very silent. I would say on par with a TQ, which...
Oh no, it's way more quiet.
Yeah, the motor noise is very pleasant. And on the tech side too, you mentioned the dual buttons. You can run it without those buttons also.
You can.
Which is, I think for me, like, that's pretty cool, just to have everything in the unit.
Yeah, because the buttons are Bluetooth, so.
Yeah.
I mean, worth noting, you covered most of the technology stuff, but the screen that's on it is touchscreen, which makes it easier to run it without the buttons should you want to.
Yeah. So let's get into, I guess, the most important part, at least in my opinion, is how does the bike ride? What are standouts? Cole, do you want to lead that off?
The bike had a very familiar feel. for me at my height, and had all the right geo numbers, the 445 mil chainstays, very used to. It did have, for me, a little bit heavier front end. It's hard to lift the front, but at speed, it's a little harder to notice. And unlike Sean, I found the bike to be very snappy and fun and playful on the flow trail we were riding. And man, you could confidently charge into corners until you hit something that had a lot of G's. And that's when the downsides of this bike started to shine, is when you're loading corners. I'm only 170 pounds, so I'm not a heavy rider by any means. But when you do load those corners, there's some frame flex. And that was kind of, talk about these bikes, there's always one weird thing. That was the kind of weird thing to me that stood out.
Okay. Jared?
Well, I know myself and a lot of my friends, when we start shopping for bikes or looking for something, we look at the numbers, and we know there's certain numbers that we like if we've been riding bikes for a while. And you look at it, and I think that's what this company did. They put it in a familiar spot. It kind of just feels like it checks a lot of the boxes, right? And then we have this motor that's really exciting. The display and the motor are better than anything that's out there, no questions asked. The bike is pretty easy to ride. It's a lot of fun. Is it the best handling bike? Does it do everything well? It does everything pretty darn well, and the motor makes it really exciting. For me, I have to decide internally, do I want a bike that is maybe, I find in some ways a little bit more playful and fun to ride downhill, or do I go with the new exciting thing in the motor that's super powerful? And I think for me, it comes down to, I like to ride with other people, and I want the bike that handles the best, that's on par with the same power output as my friends. So maybe it's not my top pick, but I could see it being a bike that a lot of people would really love.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sean, your favorite thing and your least favorite thing?
My favorite thing is climbing.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't mention that. The motor is insane.
I mean, this morning, Jared and I went out for a long haul, and on our return trip, there's a few sections where it's just rock slabs that you're supposed to just jump down. Yeah. And I was just like, nah, I'm just gonna climb up it, because why not? You got all that power, and it just zips right up. And if you're really feeling froggy, you can actually air out of those climbs.
Yeah, on some of those sections we were repeating when we were filming, and you'd climb back up, you could uphill jump the landing, like at a skate park, you're going from landing to takeoff. Yeah. And that was very, very wild. That first time hitting I call it warp speed. Yeah. It is eye-opening. Oh, this is what e-bikes should really feel like. It's crazy.
So on that real quick, it's kind of like the motor is we've talked about SL and full power e-bikes, and this motor is its own category, right? Yeah. And the bike, it still rides like a traditional bike. It's just, that's why it's exciting. That's why we talk about it. That's why we smile. It's exciting because you sense there's a bit of the future in that bike, and there's going to be an evolution that's still to come.
It had a low stack height, so we swapped stem and bars and put the one-up stuff on there with a higher rise, and I instantly noticed an improvement in the performance of the front end from a stiffness perspective and just handling comfort perspective. But there is definitely some frame stiffness issues, which you kind of talked about.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it earlier, I'm 170 pounds. We put Robert on this bike as someone that's not only a heavier rider, but he likes to load corners.
Yeah.
And I don't think he would like this bike because of that.
Maybe, Robert's 220 pounds.
Yeah, he might feel that it's a little sketchy in certain senses. And maybe if you're not the most aggressive rider, that's never gonna be a problem for you. Right. And it might even be a positive, being more compliant, right?
It is, because there were definitely scenarios where here, right, right now where we've been riding, and even back on the home trails, conditions are really dry and loose. There are some flat corners where traction is scarce, and it's undulating, and there's embedded rock and chunk, and I felt like I could really pop and pump that bike and accelerate and get momentum and speed. And I thought the traction, I was able to hold inside lines on corners, maybe amongst the best on that bike at speed. When I took the bike down and was riding in Southern California on some of my home trails, where it was very embedded sandstone and chunk, and it's high speed, big compressions, I could feel the bike kind of bind up and flex and shoot me out of these little rock pockets, and it was unsettling. So, I mean, it's like kind of one of those bikes. It's a 150, 160 bike. It's very fun, very capable, but it definitely has a limit. And I think, you know, one could argue, oh, if you convert it to mullet or you put stiffer wheels on, you put a 38, like you could do some things to improve some of the stiffness. But ultimately, I think it's probably worth just mentioning to riders, like, if all you care about is having the fastest, most powerful drive unit, it's awesome.
One of the things about
there
that,
are downsides to the bike for
like,
sure.
When you're riding your bike, you have your kind of muscle memory lines, right? How fast you can come into corners. You can come in a little bit slower, really lock in your line, and then that first crank out of the corner, you're already faster than you would have been had you done it differently or how you normally do. So the fact that you can change a little bit of your riding characteristics and utilize that power out of those corners, I thought was super fun. Like,
All right, so before we move on, I guess some of the hard news is that as of filming, this bike is not yet available in the US, and nor is there a finalized price, but we expect it'll be somewhere around the 10,000 to 10.5-ish mark. And apparently Q4 is when availability in the US or North America should happen. And it sounds like they're pressing to have potentially 100 or so dealers and support service centers. So
and that is something, you know, we didn't really touch on, is like, it's a new brand.
Yeah,
and this,
absolutely.
You know, you are taking a little bit of a risk with your investment,
For
not
sure.
knowing the support structure.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the next bike, which is the Ari Nebo Peak, the lightest bike in our shootout at 40.7 pounds. It is a 140 mil rear, 150 front, 29er, and comes with, I would say, like some pretty trail biased geo numbers. A little bit of a steep head tube angle at 65 degrees, 480 reach, 436 chain stays, 1239 for a wheelbase. A very fun and playful bike. Jared, you were the last one to ride the bike.
I just got off that bike. So it's a bike that can do most of what I want it to do. It's just, if you're not riding the biggest and the gnarliest stuff, this bike is gonna be a bike that's gonna make you smile because it's gonna be fun and it's easy to ride. Like, unless you're going into a double black, I feel like you're not gonna feel over your head on this bike. It's just pleasant everywhere. There's nothing that's a standout about it to me, but like, it's just all around a good bike, and it's not a brand I'd had on my radar, but like, I'd be happy to recommend it to my friends.
Cole, standouts, what's...
Yeah, I mean, immediately corner confidence and being able to dip it in and rely on that front wheel, even with how, you know, it's one of the steeper bikes we have on test, and I generally struggle with that. But yeah, I think the biggest thing for me was just how confident I can come into corners, which then set me up so much faster into the next section. And you know, when we were on Nightfall, that trail, you can come out of a corner real fast into a rock garden, and as soon as you got into some bigger, repeatable hits, it started to get a little overwhelmed. And I'm really glad I read clips because I could push through that. And I felt the more I was pushing into the bike through that kind of quick, bigger hits, the rear end started to fall behind. But on the flow trails and kind of lighter chunk, even jumps and stuff like that, it was very composed and super agile.
So far, climbing, excellent. Definitely a little bit steeper of a head tube angle, so puts you in a very good, comfortable climbing position. We'll see on the big chunky descending how it does.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
Goods and bads.
I was initially complaining of like the front end pushing, not feeling great, and then as soon as I said that, Cole's like, you just gotta trust it, be confident in that cornering, and just weight at front. And as soon as I did that, I was like, oh man, yeah, you can just really lean it in, and the grip is great. And then I really enjoyed hitting the jump trail on this bike. It boosts like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Jared was hitting or following with follow cam, and there was a few where I was like, oh man, last minute decisions, but still sent it.
Yeah.
And then just turned around and came back down the hill, and like it was great on everything that we were riding here. It's just a super fun and playful bike that I enjoyed, I think, riding the most, or if not second most.
And I think the RockShox suspension setup on it, like it really brought the best characteristics out of that bike. That Super Deluxe is really lively, and paired with the Lyric, I really enjoyed it.
I disagree.
Oh, interesting.
I'd love to see that with a Float X, personally. Like, I thought sometimes it felt a little like dead and thuddy sometimes. But I'll kind of get into.
Was that the travel number because you were overriding?
No, it was just when I was just pushing on it, just not even moving, just like setting it up and rebound. But then when I start riding it, it did come alive and feel totally different. And I guess a lot of people do say RockShox doesn't always feel great in the parking lot, but it feels better on the trail. And that's felt very true on this bike. Big standouts for me were light, playful, weight. It's nimble, it's agile, great bike for like a trail rider, like XC to trail duty stuff. I felt the shortcomings of the bike was when you start getting into like big high speed hits, you know, it just felt like there was a little too much anti-squat transmitting that spike in energy. You know, that was a pretty advanced trail at a pretty high speed. So it's probably, you know, for a 140, 150 bike, yeah, you're probably at the limit of what that bike's designed for, which is understandable. But
I think sometimes those things are more pronounced when we're riding a variety of bikes, and some of the bikes are meant to do those things better, right?
For sure.
At the compromise of something else.
Right. Right on. Well, I think it's a very solid bike and a great kind of all around trail duty bike. So
nice surprise.
Yeah. Let's move into another bike. Actually a bike that was in our full power e-bike shootout this spring, and that's the Cannondale Moterra SL. Sean, you want to give us some stats on that? I know you really like this bike.
I do like this bike for most situations. So the Cannondale Moterra SL, we have the one model. It retails for $87.50. Comes with a factory suspension. You got 36 Float X out back. Has an EP801 with a custom tune. Custom 601 watt-hour battery, so fairly big. 46.1 pounds. It's not the lightest, not the heaviest. For Geo, it's got a mullet configuration. We've got a 470 reach. In its slack position, it is absurd at 62.5 degrees. We've flipped the headset around, so it's 63.7. Much better, but
Still would like another half degree steeper.
Yes.
Yeah, it's got the longest wheelbase the second longest at 1283, and the longest chain stays at 453.
Yeah, and you can feel that.
Yeah,
But,
absolutely.
I mean,
Very
those long chain stays and the long wheelbase also help with a very planted feel.
Ooh, all right, first couple moments on the Cannondale, pretty promising. I started off on this little rock garden and did tip in, and the kind of slacker head tube angle made some of those slow corners a little bit more tricky, and you need to plan your line going around wide. Then decided like, hey, I'm gonna try a climb. I suck at climbs. And Dust was like, Drew would be pretty disappointed if you made that. And I made it, pretty stoked. Yeah, definitely a lot of traction going up, especially over this kind of loose shale stuff. It gave you like that length. I felt really centered on that bike, and it did have one of the taller stacks, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
It was definitely comfortable to climb.
Yeah.
I think there's an audience, right, that gets excited if you live in British Columbia or you're in Bellingham and you're like, oh, an e-bike, a super slack head angle. I ride the steeps all the time, but I get nervous because I feel like I've always shuttled that and ridden my downhill bike. You're looking at this on paper and you're like, oh, we have a really slack head angle here. And one thing I think that's part of this bike, one thing I have to give this bike credit for is that it's different than a lot of the other bikes. It has a super slack head angle, and then it has these flex stays in the rear, and it makes the bike unique. There was some contrast between the front and the rear that I think even when we moved the head angle for me, I'm at the beginning of the sizing for this bike in a large, and this bike was work for me, even though it felt like it would be really capable on some technical terrain.
Okay. For me, it was a very fun bike, but it felt like it rode heavier in some situations because I think of the long length and that slack front end feeling so far out in front of you, just kind of picking it up on slower speed stuff. I felt like it was a really stiff frame, and just being able to like rail corners and get that back end to snap and drift around. I know Dustin might have got roosted once or twice because that back end just comes around so quick. But for me, the slackness of the head angle and the length of the rear end, I think, are kind of, I'm sorry, and the bottom bracket drop. That's the other really big one.
Yeah, good point.
I love technical climbing, and that is probably like one of the hardest bikes for me to climb because of how slack it is, but also how low it is. I was hitting stuff all the time, and I really like that bike. It's just the Geo kind of is the deal breaker for me. I love the full power. I love the battery size. I love riding the bike, but I got to get up first. And
that's where you and I differ. Like, I'm happy to beeline around a technical climb. And so like that's not something that's like the most standout feature of what I have to have in a bike. It's corner confidence and just kind of all around feel, right? And in that bike, immediately it was like, oh, cool, I can pop off this rock into this loose corner. And the rear end felt quite linear. And so the feeling I was getting, especially on these trails where it was just very loose, felt like I just had continual amounts of traction out.
Yeah, I like the suspension. I mean, like I said, I really like the bike. It's just some of the numbers don't work for me. But Sean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit too slack for the travel numbers it has, I think. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed riding the couple laps that I did, and just trusting it in corners, like traction was there, or I could always just get it back over. It was fun to send deep because I knew that I could, not that I should. But climbing is more of its prowess, I think.
It's super comfy.
Yeah, super comfortable. It makes it up minutes faster than everything else, obviously being a full power bike. I like the integrations of the system. It's pretty clean. Got a nice top tube display that's similar to the Fazua system, but still more functional. And then you obviously have the add-on of an actual display.
Yeah, I mean, if you're chasing, basically, this bike is a full power bike that's a lightweight, which is awesome, right? Like, it has big travel, it has the EP801 Shimano motor that has lots of power, it has a slack angle, so like, it's like, if you don't want a bike that's over 50 pounds that's capable of doing the things the full power bikes do,
yeah,
I mean,
it's crazy.
40 pounds under 50.
That's another audience.
Yeah.
There was one negative that I found after a few minutes of descending, like big hits, because I found that the backs of my heels, I would ride a bit more inwards, and they would rub or catch on those flex stays just because they're so much wider than everything else that we have on test. And it was a bit unnerving at times having the sole of your shoe get stuck under that flex stay for a brief second.
Yeah, you guys both have
I had
size 12s,
yeah,
right?
I had a similar feeling too.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, that is the Cannondale Moterra. We'll move on to the Devinci e-Troy Lite, a 150-160 bike, hand-built and welded in Canada. The first bike that we've talked about with the Bosch unit. I think that's really cool and something worth kind of briefly going over. But yeah, 150-160, mixed wheels. Our size large had a 481 reach, 626 stack. The BB height was 346, 438 stays, and head tube angle was at 62.5. Or sorry, no, that was 63.6. I do remember it being slack, but not that slack. So 77.6 degree seat tube angle. Who wants to lead off the Devinci?
I like Bosch motors. The Bosch SX to me felt like the Fazua with a little bit more there. The bike being aluminum is a little bit heavier. One of the things I noticed is that the front end is something, some of these bikes we just feel centered on and you just go with it and you don't think about it. This one felt like I needed to weight the front a little bit. I had a lot of fun on it. It's just one of the things that I noticed about it.
Yeah, it definitely has a longer front end feel and a heavier front end feel. Almost like there's not more weight up there, but it gives that sensation. Yeah. And so when you come into a corner tentative, you're really fighting that versus coming in strong and over the bike. And that's something, one of the downsides I found. But on the other side, the rear end is super plush. Like, it's really comfortable to climb. That split pivot does a great job of kind of muting out some of those trail features. Yeah. And that I think goes a long way in who this bike could be for. You know, I can see this being a bike for a lot of people that are really just looking for a comfortable bike they can ride on a big variety of terrain.
Yeah. It's 46.2 pounds. So
It's one of the 2 cable-driven drivetrain bikes that we have on test.
Yeah, which is
It's also worth
crazy.
noting. It's
and the only
most
aluminum bike.
It's also the most affordable. So like we are comparing it to some bikes that are over $10,000.
I think the Bosch is probably the way I would go for ease of mind from reliability, durability, etc. The big thing that bums me out about them is that these all have 400 watt-hour batteries, which they burn up pretty quick. Like when and I know that the Fazuas are only 430, but it really seemed like there was a big difference, at least when you had the bikes in the eMTB or especially in the turbo mode. It seemed like the Bosch bikes were regularly the ones coming back with low battery power. So
Yeah,
But I mean, unlike the Fazua systems, you can get a range extender for the Bosch bikes.
very true. Sean, what stood out for you, pros and cons on the Devinci?
Con for me, like it felt like it had a very low stack. I mean, I climbed it up once. I felt like I was way too far over the front where it was uncomfortable. My hands were going numb. I raised it up 10 mils. It was better, but then it felt like it was all over the place, just wandering up the steep climbs that we were doing. But going down, it just plowed through everything, and I was fairly confident. And then, like, it felt like it had much shorter chain stays because I would just go around corners and the rear end would just break loose and drift around, and I was like, oh gosh,
Yeah.
feeling spicy today.
Yeah, I mean, it does have some shorter stays compared to some of the other bikes for sure, but
It's an interesting bike.
I definitely had, and we kind of talked about it, on some of the kind of flatter corners that would tighten up a little bit. I definitely felt that I had some instances where that front end was wanting to wander off trail.
And
I'm in a turn and it gets a little tighter and I'm like, oh, that front end's way out there. How do I get it back inside the rut,
Yeah, it's harder to adjust your line without coming to a crawl.
Right.
So
or just really intentionally diving the bike over. But I think it's a good bike. And I think...
What did you think about the tonality of the motor through the alloy frame compared to the other Bosch SX that we have on test?
I thought it was better, like compared to like on the Norco Fluid. I thought the Norco was it sounded a bit whinier and louder on the carbon frame in the Norco than on the Devinci, I thought.
Yeah, and it's hard to say if that comes down to one motor from them just being a little bit different than another, or if it is actually in fact the tonality coming through the frame. Yeah. Like it's hard to say.
Absolutely. So
yeah.
that's an interesting one. So I think overall, right? I mean, you guys all like it's a good bike.
It's a great
has some
value,
pros and cons. I think definitely
price point.
Yeah, region trail specific is going to be where the bike shines and who it shines for. So.
What I like about this bike is it's a very upright position for climbing. It feels really good and natural. The Bosch SX motor feels close to a full power motor. It just climbs well. I think for your average trail that's not really gnarly, this bike is just fun to ride.
All right, so Norco Fluid VLT, we have the C1 140 model. It has a retail price of $9,000. It's a 140-150 bike, mullet equipped, 64.5 degree head tube angle, so 77 degree effective seat tube angle. We've got 436 chain stays and a 472.5 reach. Okay. This bike does not have any geo adjust or anything like that. It comes equipped with a Performance Elite 36 and Float X2.
I think I would have really gelled with this bike a lot more had it had a float on it.
Something with a bit more support.
Just a little bit more peppy. Like the bike wanted to be alive, but then every time I go to like kick it into a corner or like unload, it would just be a little sluggish. And just one of those characteristics, right? Like it wasn't in a bad way. It was just something that really stood out to me. Getting it into corners was great. Like all the geo is very comfortable. Even I would say it's on the smaller size of what I look for. What Norco's doing with their chain stays, I think brings a lot of your weight really centered on the bike, and that's the feeling you get. So it is a little bit harder to kick that back end out because you are so centered.
I think, I mean, it's 41.6 pounds, so it's one of the lighter bikes.
And it's so heavy.
It didn't feel like it rode that light. I do think the shock had a lot to do with that as well. I also think the low stack had a lot to do with it. It was a 628, and I think that combined with the short reach at 472.5. And again, we chose this size because I think the next size up is too big, and 5'11", 6'1", right? You're 6'2",
and the short guy at 5'9".
Yeah, so yeah,
it's interesting
short
though,
and low up
because
front.
we're all trying to find the right size bike, the right numbers, what works for us. And for me, being between a medium and a large and a lot of bikes, this bike felt really fun. This bike, a Float X or Float X2, like the way we tune our bikes is different.
Very different.
And that's okay. We're all different in the way we like to ride. And I think our riding characteristics on the trail are similar, but the way we set up our bikes are different.
It's honestly kind of crazy. We're the same weight. I get on a bike that you've set up. I'm like, well, what is this?
Yeah,
It feels
and
crazy.
That's just part of it, right?
Yeah.
Like it's how you like to ride, how you like the bike to feel. I had no expectations going into this, but I like the way the bike looks. I think it was a lot of fun to ride. It's a bike where you're like, when am I gonna get over my head, because it's doing everything pretty well for me right now. And I think there's certainly limits, but I think this bike combined with the Bosch powertrain was a bike that I was like, okay, this is an SL category bike with a little bit more in terms of power, and it put a smile on my face. I liked it.
I like that bike too. It's really cool. Sean, what about you?
It was one of the most comfortable bikes to climb for me, probably because of that 472.5 reach. One of the things that I didn't necessarily like was the tone of the motor. Like, it just had a very high-pitched kind of drown to it, but that could just be that the tone going through that carbon frame versus the tone of the alloy Devinci. So like, it was just a bit off-putting for me. Like, it was working much harder than it should have been.
When it came to climbing, a few moments I noticed I would get out of control. It was really easy for me to kind of snap back to straight. And that, as a honestly pretty bad climber, that was really nice to have.
Yeah, I think that I really liked the Norco. The low stack height, which, if I were to keep the bike, I would put a higher rise bar on it, and that would bring me up. Yeah, it would, but the length was not so bad. It was just the shortness combined with the lowness kind of felt like it was putting me up over. But I thought that the suspension platform out back was really nice. I typically like a Float X over the X2, I think they're easier to set up, and I like that lively, springy feel. But I got along with the shock on this bike pretty well.
You were jamming along there on that last lap.
Yeah, and I mean, you were on a longer travel bike,
Yeah.
and like I was definitely pushing this like 140 rear bike pretty hard. What I did notice, and we kind of talked about it briefly with the SRAM Mavens, there's a pretty big discrepancy in performance on suspension products. Like, we have a lot of Fox 36s here, just like we have a lot of SRAM Mavens here, and like, they don't all feel the same. We put the same, the same adjustments for compression, the same air pressures, and they can feel very different. And I thought that the fork on the Fluid VLT didn't feel as good as some of the other Fox forks. Yeah. And of course, you can open it up, check, make sure it's got the right amount of fluid and oil in there. But, I think the bike industry as a whole every industry could probably work on better QC, but as far as the bike itself, I like the way it looks. I like the Bosch drive unit a lot, and I think this is a very cool 140, 150 category bike with not too many downsides.
And it's harder to find the edge on it, I would say, than like the Ari.
Yeah.
In rough terrain.
It is, I would say, a more confident and stable and planted bike in the chunky, chundery stuff. I would rather ride the Ari on flow trails and like blue trails, flatter, quick transition stuff. But I would rather plow into some, rougher stuff on that Norco, I think. Yeah. Let's move on to the Orbea Rise LT.
Yeah.
There it is. How'd you stall?
Still rolling.
Yes, that's a point.
So the Orbea Rise. I mean, it's a well-rounded bike, 485 millimeter reach, 64.5 degree head tube angle, 77.5 seat tube, 440 chainstays. I mean, all these numbers are just exhuming confidence in a mixed variety of terrain. And I think collectively we kind of all agree there. There's some standout things I know we'll get into, but for me, this bike, it can go fast, it can charge hard. You put it in low and it changes that ride. In high, it's very alive, and the frame stiffness makes it feel peppy. You kind of forget about that weight that's there, and then when you want to get on the pedals, you have that full power EPA RS motor from Orbea with those two different profiles. It's a pretty unique bike in the class.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, if you're searching for a bike that's lightweight, that has a full power motor, there's a pretty narrow field there, and Orbea has a really good reputation. I think it was given Bike of the Year for the Wild and the full power test. So I think a lot of people are curious about this bike. It's like, the numbers look good on paper, it has nice lines. I found the bike to be a really solid middle ground bike, meaning it wasn't the best at anything, but it had a lot of power. One thing to note is when you have a full power motor, it makes the weight of the bike feel lighter. Like if your bike is 50 pounds and you have 85 Newton meters of torque, it kind of offsets some of that versus being a 43 pound bike with 60 Newton meters of motor.
All right, let's see what the Shimano-equipped RS drive unit can do. It's a nice handling bike, like yanking and pulling it around to get into lines and avoid obstacles.
I really enjoyed riding this bike. There was a very distinct rattle, more prominent than any of the other bikes. Maybe it's just the bike we had, maybe it's something inside the frame that we'd have to chase down and pull a battery for. But it's something, if you're one of those OCD people that notices that stuff, it's something that happened in our field test. Probably something easy enough to remedy, but worth noting.
And I believe that bike has the most miles. I had that since the release, and I put a lot of hard miles and a lot of washing on it at home.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I did want to mention is we didn't ride it in the low setting here. This terrain really didn't call for it. But when you get that bike in low, it really eggs you on to drop your heels, and it brings more hard charging characteristics into that rear end of the bike that we're kind of all feeling. It's very supportive, but in low, it just sits in just that much more, and it's very confidence inspiring.
So it's worth mentioning that we have the LT M10 build.
Yep.
A few variations to that build, different wheels, different brakes. So it brings it up to $10,833. It is one of the only bikes with XT Di2. So I mean, what do you guys think about that over like a SRAM transmission?
I like it in the free shift. Like, I think it allows you, when you're coming down a hill and you round that corner and there's a punchy climb, you're like, oh no, you can click it without pedaling and you get 2-3 gears really quick, and then you're on the pedals up and over the feature. That for me is really cool. I didn't enjoy allowing the bike to select where you want.
I personally would rather have, like, I'm not saying that this bike's a great value or that I would spend this much, but comparing the performance, I personally would rather have a bike, if I could afford it, with the Shimano Di2 and the free shift technology and even the auto shift, if that were available on certain models that I was looking at. I especially like that kind of free shift ability. We spend a lot of time riding in deep embedded lava rock, and that technology will basically, you can override it and do it manual, you can turn it off, right? There's different profiles, it's very fast and easy, you can do it on the fly. There's a button on the shifter.
Climbing it, Jared and I both were unfortunate in having to ride it with the battery pretty close to dead. So we were in eco mode, which wasn't terrible, but obviously wasn't great. Like, it would have been easier climbing an analog bike.
Yeah, buddy.
And then
That's through no fault of the bike.
yeah, that's
just-
our fault.
It's just where we were at the end of the field test.
But in that sense too, like most of all these bikes have some sort of display that will give you your idea of battery range. That has a small LED indicator on the handlebar switch that's either green or red. Like, you don't get a choice, and you have to pair it with the app because they didn't spec with display. The display could be added on as an aftermarket part for like $130, which I think they should just spec it with that display, and if you don't want it, take it off, save that few dollars.
It's cool that it doesn't look like an e-bike. It's cool that there isn't like a permanent display on the top. I like that it's discreet.
At the same time, you still got that Shimano motor
You've got a
with
big
the case,
full-size
so it's
motor.
like,
So
you do
it's
have
not,
that.
You're not hiding it.
And you can ride it in that lower, that profile 1 with 55
Yeah.
Newton meters of torque, maximize your range, even in like profile, or I believe that they call it case 2. I was getting easy 3,000 feet out of that.
I mean, but we've got a 630 watt-hour battery in this bike, which is massive. And then you can add on a range extender.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, because we're not looking at the display right now, there's just a little, like you said, it's green or it's red, and you have a little indicator what mode you go into. But like every other bike out there, somewhere on the bike you have 5 bars, right? And you go, now I'm at 3 bars. You just don't have any of that unless you open up your phone, and that's fine, right? Like we can all open up our phone and have it Bluetooth paired, but it's something
I don't want to.
Yeah, I think it just needs to be a little more, and I'm sure next year it will be.
So yeah, for me, big pros are extremely versatile. I think it's a well-rounded bike. I like the full power. I like that you've got a big battery range, or I should say big mileage range with this good-sized battery, that it's not overly heavy. The suspension platform I really got along with. I ran it a little soft. I ran with a little less air pressure, but I think it's a super well-rounded bike.
Yeah.
I don't like some of the features or I don't know, design elements. Like I don't like the lack of a screen. I don't like the headset cable routing, but other than that, I think it's a really solid bike and one I would absolutely recommend and be very happy owning myself. So the Pivot Shuttle SL, I would say, is probably the bike that looks the least like an e-bike in the bunch.
Certainly one of them.
Shortest travel, 132 mil out back. Our particular build's got a 160 mil fork, though I think usually they come with a 150, right? Yeah. Fazua Ride 60 drive unit. It is 43.5 pounds, so a pretty light bike. And let's see, I get Geo on this thing, I think is definitely on the kind of more the XC spectrum, I would say, to trail duty stuff. We have a size large, got a 482 reach, 65.5 degree head tube angle, 76.5 degree seat tube angle, 1239 wheelbase, and 432 chain stays. So why don't you lead this one off there, Jared? Since you, I think, did the most damage to this bike. Sorry, Pivot.
Yeah.
I don't know, it was working after he did it.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's poor bike.
Fair play. So to our friends that are counting grams and are coming from a background of maybe cross-country racing, I mean, this bike is longer than that, right? It's more capable than even cross-country bikes. The downcountry style is very capable these days. I would say this bike is another bike, if you're making that transition from regular bikes to e-bikes, this bike just feels like a regular bike. It's light, it's nimble. On the right trails, it's a hoot to play with. If you want a bike that can do everything, that's gonna be your only bike, and you wanna ride the blacks, you might get out of your comfort zone on this bike. What do you guys think?
I would say you definitely will.
Yeah.
It's for sure the most peppy, lively. I pulled for gaps that I didn't see on other bikes on this bike. But it does reach its limit, and from what I found, there's a pretty hard edge when that limit's found.
Yeah.
And as we were talking on the ride, I was like, man, I think this would be better with a 150 almost, because it wouldn't egg you to ride the bike past. But when you stay within the trail spectrum, it's really fun. And it definitely is the easiest to pedal with that motor. Yeah. You know, weight-wise, for me, the seat tube angle was a big drawback, and having to have the seat slid forward on the rails. And it's an issue that I commonly run into, and it was just a little exaggerated on the Shuttle for me. But with that said, the 132 mil rear feels really good. Like, it's very supple when you're climbing, and over the small chatter, that DW link it feels great.
Yeah. So, I mean, you really like the bike, but it just, I mean, when you were having those moments where you were not having a great experience, it was because you were outside the
Yes.
the area that bike's supposed to be.
If I rode fun and playful, not trying to charge hard fast into corners. It was really fun to load up and pop out of the corners. And watching how Rob rides, it's like, oh, I feel like Rob right now, like just popping out of corners and manuals. And there was a clip I made, Niles hike back up, like, dude, you gotta come get this. I found a gap, and I had not seen that on the trail we rode like 5 or 6 times. So that was really fun, and it feels like a backcountry, shorter wheelbase, steeper head tube, lighter terrain, going out for a scenic ride. That's kind of what I feel this bike falls into.
Okay, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a bike that I can very easily be ridden in over its head, or can get yourself into trouble if you're hauling butt down a flow trail and there's some tables coming up that you're like, oh, this is the right amount of speed, and then you just hit the jump and you're like, this was too much speed.
Yeah.
And like, you just end up riding the whole trail like that, just out of control, but it just wants to go faster. Like the build we have this year is 5 pounds heavier than the build we had last year, and it's got a much cheaper spec component. So I mean, I'd say a little bit burlier, so it kind of wants to give you you got a little bit more room to play with maybe. But I mean, then it got DNF'd by pole, and
Hey, too many watts. Like, put
just
down the power.
It made it all till the last
And
night.
that's not the bike's fault. That's the
pole fault.
I guess just to specify exactly what these two guys have done to that bike, you bashed your obnoxiously large pedals into the same rock twice.
And I did, and it caused the crank arm to get bent. And then when I took the pedals out, the threads were done.
Okay.
And then we fixed that by stealing parts from another bike. And then we did a race.
I bent the cassette.
Yes.
Just folded one of the gears in the cassette.
It has nothing to do with pivot. It has everything to do with us.
So, yeah.
But charging hard, having fun, like,
Yeah.
you know, the bike eggs you on. Like,
So
It does a little bit. So
coming from the Midwest, where the trails aren't as rocky, I would say that a lot of maybe the people that I've ridden with in the past that are exploring e-bikes that like to do big adventures would really like a bike like this that's kind of in the middle, that is very light and efficient, where they could grind out big rides on it and maybe go further in the day before they lose the daylight.
Santa Cruz Heckler SL, 150, 160 mixed wheel bike. It's got 480 reach, 344 bottom bracket height, and 443 stays, 1263 wheelbase, 77.5 seat tube, and a 64.3 head tube. Another Fazua bike with a 430 battery. It weighed in at 45.6 pounds.
So, I mean, we've got the stout build, so it's got a little bit burlier spec than some of their other offerings. 38 float Performance Elite fork, float X2 Performance Elite shock, and then it's got your SRAM GX Eagle, not transmission, drivetrain, kind of help maybe, I guess it's a little bit burlier than a transmission. I wouldn't think so.
I don't know. I think transmission is supposed to, you can stand on it, dude. Nothing gets burlier than transmission.
Yep. And then we've got another set of SRAM Maven brakes. These are the bronze spec, which I think have been holding up a little bit better than the spec that we have on the Ari, which I think were silvers. It's a pretty sweet bike with the build that it has on it, I think. The value to spec ratio just is not there.
No.
But it is a Santa Cruz, and it's something that we've pretty much come to expect in their pricing structure.
And I will say, you talked about the SRAM Maven brakes on this comparing to the Ari. While the consistency in performance is there, these have developed a rather
Obnoxious squeak.
loud squeak and chirp. We'll cue a soundbite. Let's lead it off with some of the ride impressions and thoughts.
yeah, so this was the first bike and the last bike I rode. Yesterday on our kind of initial setup ride, we had it in low, and it was really fun when you were going fast downhill, but going up, it was a little bit floppy in the corners. So this morning we transitioned it to the high setting, and that made a huge difference on the climbs, and I didn't feel that much drawbacks on that first trail we rode, which was pretty high speed. but that high speed feeling of stability was still there, but then you got back a little bit more playfulness, and it ended up manualing a little bit better, popping, playing, stuff like that. And yeah, that first trail we rode was 8 minutes of pure fun. Immediately getting on this bike, you just feel like in it. Like the stack on it was perfect for me. That small rear wheel, like when you're diving into corners, you just had this really aggressive position, but then you could also ride kind of relaxed and still get a lot out of the bike. I don't have a lot of VPP experience, and so I'm maybe not as jaded here as Drew when it comes to the feel of the suspension. I found that across not only the chatter, it did good, and I think when we were talking on our ride, like I ride heavy on it, so I might not be getting some of those same sensations, but man, was it fun. Like I just look at fun factor and confidence, and that to me is what this bike exudes, and yeah, it's really cool. I had the most fun on it, I think.
Jared?
This bike, paralleling some of the things he said, it's very neutral, and I feel like I could just get on this bike from any other bike and not think about where my balance is and just corner quickly and hard. It feels slack and easy to ride, but it doesn't feel so long that when you're climbing and have a technical tight corner that you've got to deal with the extra forgiveness of like a slacker geometry downhill bike. Like it's very well rounded. It's just in the middle of everything, and there's very few times where I was like, oh, I'm in over my head. Just really well balanced bike, really easy to ride. We can all agree that they do things that typically work. Some of the things that I like outside of that is just that they typically choose some bright colors or do things differently in terms of like, you know, just bringing something there they bring a little extra, and I appreciate that. And I think that reflects in the price sometimes, is that their bikes are sought after, and you're gonna pay a little bit more for the same build as some of the other brands that are up and coming. And that's just part of it, and you have to decide where the value is for you.
Okay, Sean?
I thought this was a very comfortable bike to climb. It's also one of the last bikes that I rode, and it put me in a pretty good seated position where I wasn't hunched over and hating life afterwards. My hands weren't numb at the top of a climb, and then descending it, like, just didn't have to think. Just turn my brain off and go down the hill, and like everything felt really good, and it's super playful. And like through some of the chunky stuff, I didn't notice any drawbacks or things like that. It's just really good.
It had a really soft line of overriding it for a 150, 160.
Mm-hmm.
Like I found that like, oh, you can get in over your head, and then you're like, well, I'm really confident that I'm gonna make that corner at the bottom of this section, so I can let off the brakes, or I can pop off that rock.
So what I found on this particular bike, not being a huge VPP fan, is that, and with this shock especially, there is a pretty small window that you can get that shock to feel as best as it can. And I felt like I found it early on when we first got the bike. I felt like when we first showed up here for the group test, I was in a good spot. You know, as you start cycling through bikes and repeating bikes and trails, like you start to really pick up on subtleties and nuances. And it's like, I kind of replicated that tune, but then stuff just felt different. Maybe that's just all the extra hours and dust in the suspension now. But all that to say, I'm completely in agreement with you guys. This bike is one of the most confident and fun, playful, like, even though I kind of regularly say I'm not the biggest VPP fan, I think Santa Cruz might be one of the best brands when it comes to nailing in the bike, handling, geo, feel. Like, I don't know what it is about their bikes, but like they got their numbers dialed. Like, you just get on that thing and you feel good and strong and in control. And one of my favorite things about the bike is how easy it is to just power drift and slide that back into like quick little check turns. It just is like, like both feet up and flat. You just kind of like give a little pump and a push, and that back end will just snap out and into a little corner. And it's a very, very fun bike. I wouldn't say it's the most poppy and fun to get airborne, but like, like it feels like it's a little heavy sometimes, but like, as far as like on the ground playfulness, like manuals, wheelies, slapping the bike around, one of the most fun playful bikes for sure. And I really do like it. It's a good bike. Sean, Jared? I know I feel like you're pretty tight with your pennies, but Sean, I know you really are.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Like, the value isn't there, but I mean, it's Santa Cruz. You get a lifetime warranty. The biggest drawback for me would be the longevity of that Fazua system.
Okay.
Like, if that motor goes outside of warranty, then you got a brick and you got to pay for it outside.
All right, well, Santa Cruz Heckler SL, I think a very fun bike above all else, I think is the big takeaway for me, and pretty well-rounded, I would say. And if you're a Santa Cruz fan and you like a stiff and playful bike, I think it's gonna be a really solid machine, so.
So next up, we've got the Specialized Kenevo SL. We've got SL2 actually. We've got the Expert build. It's got the Specialized 1.2 SL motor, which came out in the Levo SL earlier this year or last year. 320 watt-hour battery. It's got RockShox Zeb Select fork, Vivid Select Plus rear shock, GX Eagle transmission, $10,000 price tag, which is pretty high for what we're getting. In terms of geo, it's a 170 bike, size 4. It's got a number of geo changes, like headset you can adjust in 3 different positions. You've got a high-low out back. So in its nominal position, 63.5 degree head tube angle, 76 degree seat tube angle, 350 mil bottom bracket height, and 447 chainstays.
Yep. The longest wheelbase at 1287.
And it sure feels like it.
One of my notes I had in my phone is long bike go fast, long bike go slow. It's very polarizing and really is dependent on the terrain. I think that bike specifically is the most terrain dependent bike we have.
Yeah. Do you think that's mostly because of the size?
The overall
length.
wheelbase, yeah. Because the reach is
45
great,
is not
right?
big.
And it's polarizing because it can feel so bloody good, but then you reach a longer, tight section of trail, you're like, okay, where's the Ari?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I've found that this bike really did well on super chunky terrain, like up that kind of first trail we did up on the top of the ridge, where it's like just moments of kind of picking up speed, but then some slow, just clunky rocks. And I thought the suspension did really good getting into there, and that's an easy place for a bike to not feel great. And I think it did quite well there. The 170 millimeter crank length for me was a bummer. Again, I like technical climbs and I ride in lots of rocks and other big obstacles when I'm pedaling. That was a bummer. The relatively low power compared to some of the other drive units was a bit of a bummer. The battery size, 320, I felt like that bike also was regularly on E, flashing red pretty quick.
But it was one of the most efficient, so it does make the best use of that battery size.
But when you're trying to keep up with, the Fazua, the Bosch, the Shimano bikes, you've got it in boost all the time, trying to hang on. And granted, there's a range extender, then you lose the water bottle cage, to that. But it's a really good bike. I'm 5'11", 6'2", 6-ish, 6'1",
5'9". Yep.
You've owned this bike in the S3.
And the first version with a slightly less powerful motor.
Okay. I think at 5'11", I probably would like the S3 more, although technically, based on sizing, I could fit the S4. I like a shorter bike, but at 485, it's not that short of a reach. It's just the bike is so long.
Yeah.
It's the overall length.
But I love the way the bike corners when you have speed. Like, it's impressive how well you can slam the back end into some turns.
It is quote unquote playful for how big it is, I think. More leverage.
Maybe on the ground.
Yeah.
When it came time to hitting stuff and getting into the air or like trying to move the bike around, I just felt like I felt awkward aboard it.
It's more of the changing. It changes direction really naturally.
Yeah. I had moments where I just felt really awkward on it because of how long it was overall. But Jared, what do you think?
Yeah. This is an interesting one because I think the people that ride bikes a lot, the first thing we look at, one of the first numbers we look at are the reach and the head angle of a bike. And when you look at this bike from a reach standpoint, you're like, yep, I'm an S3, I'm a medium. Yep, I'm an S4, I'm a large, because that's the reach that I'm used to. But because the wheelbase is so long on this bike, it kind of changes things. And I would encourage somebody that's maybe exploring having a really light, long travel capable downhill descender to, if they're not on the far end of it, to maybe ride a size, to try both sizes in the store and maybe consider sizing down, because I've probably never cornered better than I did on this bike when I sized down. And that's including the Orbea Wild that I own right now. So like, there's a lot there that's to like, and the adjustable geometry is very exciting. And at $10,000, I'm a little less excited about the bike. But there's a lot there. If you want something really light that can charge downhill, and you get it in the right size, it's pretty exciting.
And you live in the right area.
Yeah.
Because I think it really is terrain dependent, because there's no denying how good the rear suspension feels.
Yeah.
Like through chunk. It's great.
It
really
absolutely eats. Yeah, if you just hold on and let that thing go to work, it will plow down some stuff for sure.
And I think
it's impressive.
Collectively, very big fans of the Vivid rear shock.
Great shock, yeah.
I would argue that the Kenevo motor itself is probably one of the louder ones that we've had on test.
Yes, it absolutely is.
But I do like Specialized ecosystem, like the Mastermind TCU.
Their software
is super clean.
Yeah,
like
Micro
it's
adjust
second to Amflow's display.
Yeah.
The small controller on the handlebar is easy to use, unless you're trying to switch between modes on the or displays. Yeah. Because you got to adjust your fingers and
stuff. Specialized has done more e-bike, mountain bike iterations than anybody at this point.
Yeah, but yeah, to Cole's point, the micro tune, like that's all I use if I'm riding that bike. Like I'll put it at 40, 50% and just slow pedal my way up the hill. Yep. And I think it's a bike that kind of rewards a more slow peddler, just cruise control type deal.
I guess final thoughts overall.
It's a great bike if you have a long, mellow fire road to some sweet DH.
If you're somebody that likes a long wheelbase and the stability of that, and you don't have tight stuff back home, and you like to ride steep stuff, it's this bike and one other bike I have in mind. You know, there's a lot there to like. It just depends on what you want. And if you don't have friends on full power bikes, or you don't have to be chasing somebody in with a huge motor, there's a lot of these bikes available, and they're pretty fun to ride. Just really make sure you get the sizing right. It's important on this bike.
The TQ is definitely the underdog here. It's got the lowest power. What is cool about the display is it'll show watts. So if you're kind of a numbers nerd, that's a plus.
Well, let's move on to the next big hitter, and that is the Trek Slash Plus. This is a bike that we actually got from Trek back in Crankworks. It's the TQ drive unit with a 580 watt hour battery. The least powerful drive unit, right? Probably one of the most quiet next to the DJI Avinox.
Yeah, and our size large, 479 mil reach, 434 mil chain stays, 63.4 degree head tube angle, 77.2 degree effective seat tube angle. All pretty aggressive numbers, I would say, and really kind of points this bike in a certain direction.
So just to compare both 170 millimeter bikes, the Specialized was 1287 wheelbase, and the Slash is 1267. That's 20 millimeters of difference.
Could have to do with the difference between being a 29er or a mullet.
It's still 20
in
mil, doesn't matter where it
in
comes
part,
from.
but I mean, it is 20 millimeters shorter, and that is very noticeable on the trail. And I guess, granted, it does have a mid-high pivot, so that rear center length does grow a bit as it goes into sag and then travel. But I never felt like this bike was hard to maneuver or get through stuff, and even climbing it, the traction was, I would say, second to none. Of course, the downside is the drive unit, and it is 46.2 pounds, making it tied with the heaviest, I guess.
Pretty close.
Yeah, so let's lead this one away. Have you ever ridden a Trek Slash, or are you a high pivot fan? What do you think?
I've never ridden a Trek Slash, but I am a huge high pivot fan. Okay. If you're riding big burly stuff and you have a lot of travel, there's a lot of compression, and that inevitably leads to your chain being tugged, and that makes the bike feel not smooth. And when you have a high pivot, you eliminate a lot of that, and it feels really good. The downside of that is that high pivots generally are a little less efficient to pedal uphill. If you want a bike that doesn't need the charge at the top of the hill and you want to ride steep slabs and not feel scared and you want a little bit more safety net, there's no more safety net than this bike. It's the closest to riding a downhill bike that you're going to get with a motor on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I would say that, even on flatter terrain, especially through some more peaked rock gardens, getting that wheel out and away from you, going through that, it feels like you can just carry more speed. Aside from the great feeling rear suspension, that feeling of that wheel going away from you versus just straight up does give a more plush and soft feel, leading you faster into corners to a faster time.
Yeah.
And
Of course, there are downsides to
there
that
are
lengthening rear
downsides.
end.
So
Yes.
when you do lean it in and you get loaded into a corner, that wheelbase grows. And it is a very unique and distinct characteristics that high pivot bikes have.
Yeah.
And you can either be indifferent and don't care, you can really not like it, or you can be a fan of it. And I think there's kind of three user groups there.
Yeah.
And you mentioned riding at Whistler. This bike on Ho Chi Minh was so fun. There's barely any bumps on there. Super tight corners, and man, you could just get that bike moving side to side, transition your weight, and it was really predictable and what was gonna happen when you were unloading out of those corners.
Yeah. Yeah, and I rode some of the enduro race tracks that were over on Blackcomb, which were a lot rougher and bumpier than that. And like as soon as it started pointing downhill and the bumps got bigger and the speeds got up, it was almost like the bike just asked for more.
Yeah.
And it like got smoother and just better. And I was like, oh, this bike could get me in real trouble. And granted, on that ride, we were climbing with 2 or 3 other guys on slashes. And so it was more reminiscent of being on like a non-e-bike ride, the pace, the conversation, what you're doing. Sean, what do you think?
Aside from echoing the climbing statements, this going down on the bike was like, I thought it muted out a lot of the trail, but that's not necessarily a con in itself. Like it just goes fast. It's like riding a couch through even the gnarliest, loosest rock gardens. It's just like, okay, the only time I felt a rock is if I hit a loose one and it came up and hit the wheel or hit the stays or something. And then it was some of the most confidence I've had on one of these bikes going down like Nighthawk. Just point and shoot and hold on and you're gonna have a good time. And traction was very good even through like the loosest stuff and just like, yeah, it was a solid time.
Okay. Now you are not a fan of pedaling and climbing. Would the lack of power be a deal breaker for you on this bike?
If I'm riding by myself, no. But if I have to ride in a group where everybody else is on any of these other systems, aside from maybe the Specialized, then probably. Or I just have to realize that I'm gonna be about 10 minutes behind everybody else.
Yeah.
But like it's the TQ system and like the Specialized system, you just have to go into it with the mindset of, I'm just gonna turn my brain off, pedal up the hill, and when I get there, I get there. It's not a race. But yeah, it's certainly a buzzkill. I would much rather see a Fazua or an Avinox system on this bike.
All right, so that is the Trek Slash. Power is a letdown, but I think we agree this thing is absolutely the beast for going downhill. So. Moving on to our final bike, and that is the YT Decoy SN. Sean, let's talk about build and spec.
So we've got the Core 2 model with a retail price of essentially $6,500. RockShox Zeb Select, Vivid Select, Fazua Ride 60 system. It's got the 430 watt-hour battery. It's the only bike that has TRP DHR Evo brakes, which is a blessing for such an affordable build. And as far as geo goes, it's your 160, 170 mil mullet bike, 475 reach, 64.2 degree head tube angle, little weird numbers there, but 78.3 degree effective seat tube angle, 1263 wheelbase, and 442 chain stays.
With a 45.6 pound weight.
So, I mean, it's not light, not heavy.
Yeah.
But
I felt that it rode heavy.
Road
though.
heavy, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, it definitely rode, in some instances, heavier than the Trek, I thought.
I would agree. I was really expecting it, having ridden other YT bikes, to be really kind of peppy.
Yes.
And that's not what I felt at all.
Do you think that shock had anything to do with it?
You know, on that last lap, when we were experimenting, we did play with pressures a bunch. Getting that bike in particular to feel balanced, where the rear end felt similar to what the fork was doing. The fork was we were way oversprung, and still that rear felt very stiff, and there was quite a few moments of harshness, but I still bottomed out. It was a polarizing one, because when you were going fast, and it was really fun to like foot off and like slam into corners. I didn't mind the 50 mil stem. Like, it felt high and it was a comfortable bike, but there was just some things that were drawing me away from really having a good time, especially when the trail got flatter.
Yeah. Okay. I do think that this is a bike where the suspension package maybe could have affected our feel and performance. We were going back and forth a lot on the final ride, and I found that one click on that select fork made a huge difference from the bike compressing like this to compressing more evenly and feeling so much better, because it was really hard to get the front and back to match
There's
up.
a little seesawing feeling going.
Yeah, and so I think maybe a little nicer spec on the suspension could have helped, but the bike for sure liked to go faster and hit bigger hits, and that I felt is where it shined the most. What did you think?
It was an easy bike to ride. I felt confident on it. It's hard to compare sometimes because the specs of these bikes are different, and this is the second cheapest bike on the list. Being the shorter strider and having a 50 millimeter stem and having a long wheelbase, I think I would feel more confident on this bike a size down. All that to say that I felt pretty comfortable on the bike. I just couldn't quarter in as fast on this bike as some of the other bikes because it felt a little stretched out to me.
Which is funny because it's got a 475 reach, and
Yeah.
the Santa Cruz you like so much has a 5 millimeter longer reach.
Right, right. And that's why I think it's important to not just look at geocharts and decide what's best. I think sometimes you just have to ride bikes.
I was the first one on this bike, and I thought it was a blast to ride. I mean, Moore Park, it was super fun, just being able to point, shoot, hop down everything, kind of just hit corners. But I was going back to thinking about how Rob was riding his bike during the launch, and I was like, if he can do that, I can attempt to be like Rob. It was one of the bikes that I had the most fun and was able to manual with, which I can never manual an e-bike, so that's just a little bit of bonus points for me. The downsides came on day 2 riding that bike. First lap, great. Had a blast going down the trail. Then we decided to climb up, get some photos, video on the single track, and the motors took a crap. Wouldn't drive power. The LED hub would stay on, but it's just dead.
It worked intermittently for the rest of the day out on the trail. Took it to the trail the next day, and it actually worked. I think Travis rode it pretty much all day. Then I guess towards the end of that day, I was gonna go ride it, and sure enough, wouldn't work because electronics hate me. And I pulled the drive unit out of the bike, and I unplugged every little connection I could. I, dropped battery. I did all the stuff. Nothing was apparent. I rode around the parking lot. It didn't turn on. And I'm pedaling. I'm like, well, I guess I'll pull the pedals off and hop on something else. And just as I rounded the corner to go back to the car, it powered up. And I was like, okay, I'm not gonna stop pedaling. And I just grabbed my helmet off the ground and kept pedaling. And then it worked. There was only one other time, 2 days later, that it cut out for 30 seconds, and then it came back on. So all that to say, we have lots of other bikes with Fazua drive units. So it's not a YT issue, it's a Fazua thing. And so yeah, I mean, any drive unit could potentially have problems. And I guess taking that out of the equation and just focusing on the bike itself and how it rides, where does it stand?
I had moments you look at the levels and internally here, we were we had our own sheets and we had our own kind of scoring system that we were working on just to understand our feelings. And it was really high, but then it was also really low. And so that balanced out to being the lowest scoring bike.
And that wasn't the same for me. I got on a bike that, I was riding a bike that was maybe a little bit more XC oriented, and I got on that bike and I kind of just like was like, whew, and I felt more confident and I wanted to ride it fast. I wasn't saying that it was good everywhere for me, mainly because I think the bike is long and cornering was a little bit more of a struggle, but I enjoyed riding the bike. I like the way the bike looks. It was unfortunate that we had those issues with the motor, but looking at this field test of 11 bikes, 4 of them have this motor, so like we can't really, I think it's, you know, there's a reality there. And I've had similar issues with a Bosch motor in the past, and I don't think it was, I think it was a connection issue. And I think for our analog friends, this might just be like less is more sometimes, and I see how they could be like, okay, I don't want to deal with that, right? Just like having an electronic drivetrain, like you bring in some convenience and there is a more variable and there's more opportunity for something to maybe be an issue, but we don't know exactly. Yeah.
Final thoughts for you on the bike?
I mean, I thought it was a fun planted bike. I mean, it's not gonna be for everybody. Like in my notes, I have it for maybe somebody that likes like light enduro riding or just a trail rider that wants a little bit more suspension. But it's just, I mean, it's a very middle of the road bike, I think.
Robert, when I talked to him, because he went to the launch, granted I think he rode the higher spec model, he said he has never been able to ride an e-bike more aggressively in all of the e-bikes he's ridden, and he really, really liked that bike a lot. Travis also said he really enjoyed this bike, and it is one that gave him quite a bit of confidence. He's a similar height to you. And it was a bike, yeah, he liked a lot.
I wanted to go that way.
This is the hardest shootout I think we've ever had to do, and I think that's because the bikes are so all over in this niche or genre or whatever. Like, we have full power bikes, we have mid power bikes, we've got, you know, long travel, mid travel, short, like it's just really hard to just say this is the best e-bike of the year, because, you know, if you moved back to Wisconsin and you said the best e-bike of the year for you today is this, and you went home, you probably wouldn't feel the same way.
We have 11 bikes on the shootout, and it's not like any of them are bad. We just have to decide on, we don't have to decide on it. You have to decide on like what you want for your style of riding. If you ride in groups, I encourage you to find a bike that's similar, and talk to your friends. If you're new to e-bikes, get a bike that's on the similar powertrain. Most of your friends are riding bikes that have Fazuas, you're good with a Fazua. If your friends have full power bikes, you really need to consider that, because
don't buy the TQ.
You'll be in turbo and you'll be draining your battery. All that to say, don't buy a bike just on the motor.
I'm a huge believer in that.
Yeah.
I would much rather have a better mountain bike with an inferior drive unit than the best drive unit and a worse mountain bike. And I've tried to tell lots of people that. We get a ton of emails, DMs, YouTube comments from people that are asking us, oh, I really want this drive unit, but it's only available on this bike on sale. And to me, it's like nowhere near as good of a bike as this drive unit that is not as desirable on a way better bike. And to me, like, that's like having a car with 1,000 horsepower that handles like garbage versus a car with 500 horsepower that handles so much better. And it's like, do you just want to go fast and straight? Then I guess 1,000 horsepower is cool, but I want a car that handles good and I'll take less power. So I don't know, everybody's different, and some people just want to be the first one up the hill, and that's totally cool because there's different strokes for different folks, right? So. We had 2 other testers that were helping us. Unfortunately, one of them had to go home early, but he did a lot of mileage testing, power and watt hour consumption testing for us. We established a test loop.
Travis's test loop was 13 miles long, about 2,000 feet of vert. He ran the bikes in boost exclusively. Now, some of these bikes maybe didn't fit him properly, so there could have been a bit of a struggle, like time penalty for that, but essentially Our Fazoo systems, he ran that test loop in 1 hour, 7 minutes and burned 270.9 watts, only bested by the Specialized, which burned 259 watts. But there's a 5-minute penalty essentially for that loss of power. The Bosch at 272 watts burned 1 hour, 8 minutes to complete that loop. DJI was probably the least efficient at 392 watts burned, but you got an 850 watt peak power motor just sucking down juice. But he completed that loop in 58 minutes.
By far the fastest.
So 9 minutes faster than the Fazoo system. And then TQ was the slowest at 1 hour and 16 minutes and burned 285 watts.
Okay, and then Shimano?
Shimano was 1 hour and 1 minute.
Okay.
So second place, obviously another full power bike, and with 378 watt hours burned.
All that to say, we don't really have a clear winner.
There is one clear winner, motor-wise.
Yes. So what we have come up with, and hopefully it's more helpful, is the most impressive e-bike, I think, and is showing and electronics integration and pretty much everything, right, is the Amflow with that DJI Avinox. It's
undeniable.
It is, like I said, if I worked for a tech startup company in Silicon Valley, a disruptor. Like, people should be shaking in their boots right now. As long as that thing doesn't blow up 6 months down the road, right? We don't know that yet.
It's very unknown.
But if that thing lasts anywhere near what a Shimano or a Bosch or a Fazoo lasts, dude, like the industry is changing and needs to be holding on, right?
Yeah. I think it'll just push the other brands to get better, and
or we're gonna see that drive unit on a lot of other brands' bikes.
I think it's both. You know.
Would you guys buy that bike? I mean, because like I said, it's not about having 1,000 horsepower if the bike doesn't ride well. I mean, where does this bike sit in the lineup for your riding style?
Yeah, I think for me, the flexiness feel of that when I was pushing hard and feeling good was enough to kind of turn me away from making that the bike that I would want to take home.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's definitely a bike that is exciting, and right now I would be happy to take that home and have fun with it and then ride within its limits. If it's the end all and it's the only bike I'm ever gonna have, it's probably not the bike I'd pick. The Heckler is a little bit more comfortable for me to corner with. If people are asking for recommendations based on what they want to ride, the Nebo Peak for the average person that likes to mountain bike that isn't pushing hard, I think Ari is a great value. I think they have good builds, they're good looking bikes. I think that's something people should consider. If they want a bike that just makes them feel like a better mountain biker that's easy to ride, it's hard to deny that Heckler's very neutral and easy to ride. If you're not in a hurry, you don't need to get to the top and you want to ride rowdy stuff, if this is for your 16-year-old kid that just is sending it all the time, get him on the Slash, because that thing is a safety net. Like it can handle stuff. Okay. There's a lot of good bikes on this list.
Sean?
I mean, I think Jared pretty much nailed it on the head.
Okay.
I would agree with all of that.
Which one are you putting on the back of your truck though?
I mean, I'd be between the Heckler SL and the Nebo Peak. It would depend on where I wanted to ride that day.
Yeah.
Like if I'm riding more flowy stuff, I'll go Nebo Peak. If I'm gonna go rockier stuff, then I'll probably go the Heckler SL.
Yep. And may have been a little obvious from the time we talked about the Santa Cruz. That's bar none. That's the one that I would take home.
Okay, and you?
The Heckler, I think that geometry and the way that bike feels is really good. The VPP, you know, whatever you feel about that, like it's a bike that's just really easy to ride, and yeah, that's kind of where I land.
Okay.
Yeah.
We internally had a chart for each bike so that we could put numbers to individual characteristics of the bike's performance. That way we could step away from colors or looks or feelings and try to just like get a little bit more mathematical. And the Orbea is not a bike that like excites me, but it was one of the highest scoring bikes for me when I eliminated emotion and I just said this trait, this trait, this trait. And like I gave it a number attributed to that trait. That bike just does what I want it to do. even if it doesn't really excite me or visually wow me or anything else. And it does have its drawbacks, but every bike has drawbacks.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with this category of bike right now. We've talked about it. Every one of these bikes has a problem, like a big problem, right? And it's either a lack of power, it's either the battery's not the size I want, the geo's not right. Like there's something has an issue. If the Amflow was stiffer, 100% I would pick that bike. It's just a little too flexy for me. I think I would probably order an Orbea Rise LT. I would, maybe do the spec, and I would definitely go with a different color, but that probably is the do-it-all bike I would like. I just think it's so well-rounded and versatile. I just really like it. Hopefully that the reviews, both individual and here, will help guide you, right? I think hopefully someone from the East Coast and the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest will all find value in different elements of each of these bikes and help you make a better decision. Speaking of help, we would like to thank the Running Y Resort here in Klamath Falls, Oregon, Outdoor Research, Schwalbe Tires, and Ride Concepts Shoes for making this series happen. We've got a pretty big crew down here, and they eat a lot of food. So without their support, and of course some of our awesome YouTube members. And speaking of our YouTube membership, we are looking to grow that side of our channel by producing a lot more content for members. So if you find value in these types of series and want to see us do more, please consider joining the members channel. We are hoping to grow that side of the channel enough to where we can bring in one of our members for every shootout. So if you would like a chance to come and join us here, let's grow that members side of the page big enough to where we can bring you out, host you, and bring you in to one of these tests. Thank you guys very much, and we'll see you out on the trails.